So, hi everyone. I'm here with Guy Statter, who's the head of UK sales for Qualco. So, Guy, thanks very much for joining me today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here, Chris.
So, it'd be good to hear. I mean, certainly from a Qualco point of view, in terms of like, what are some of the things that you've been hearing in the market? It's been a pretty crazy last couple of years. What are sort of the themes that you've sort of been seeing recently?
So I guess recently is in two parts, isn't it? So the, the reasonably recently is everything to do with COVID and the reactions to that and all of the different things about needing to work from home and to just help people as much as we could on that basis. And then more recently, obviously, we have the cost of living crisis, which has presented different but related problems. The first was very much about using digital channels to service people as best we could, but also in addition to that, making sure that people were able to do home working. And then more latterly, it's about can we find more tools and integrate to more tools to help people quickly, because virtually everybody has got less money in their pockets, and certainly in the credit and collections arena, that's creating new and different problems for everybody. So
Yeah.
that's kind of that's been the general trend, but the two are very much related.
And what's your kind of view on, I suppose, arrears volumes and collections volumes? I mean, we're hearing quite a bit that they haven't increased. I mean, are you starting to hear from your clients that they're starting to feed through yet, or are we still in that wait and see mode to really see what's going to happen before they flow through? It's more sort of upstream.
So I think the so-called tsunami of debt is still pending, but we all expect it to come at some point, and we all, I mean, clients, people you speak to in the industry, etc. I think there are pockets already starting to come through quicker, and that is obviously in the areas where perhaps you would expect, which is people who perhaps would normally struggle anyway, who are perhaps resorting to using forms of credit that they perhaps would have done, like buy now, pay later. Also, the lower end of the SME space. But I think as it stands at the moment, people's behaviours are being relatively preemptive. So people are being very proactive with managing and monitoring their energy consumption, for example, their use of travel, their use of or buying luxuries, etc., etc. And anecdotally, people are buying themselves less things for Christmas, all of those sorts of things. So we're all expecting it to happen, but I think at the moment people are just adjusting their lives a little bit, to sort of preempt what might happen. But it is going to still get worse in the new year, I'm sure.
How much of a watershed do you think the pandemic was? Almost like we had almost like before the pandemic and then after the pandemic. I mean, do you think we've gone through a much more sort of fundamental shift in terms of the way we do business, the way we interact, or do you think it's just sort of transitory?
Um, so I guess someone described it to me as bit like being in wartime, in that the speed of change was as such that things were being allowed to happen very, very quickly. And so I think it has been shown that people can work from home successfully.
Mm.
However, there is a knock-on impact of that around things like mental health and ultimately the levels of collaboration that can happen, which are different to if you're in the office together and so on and so forth. So in terms of where people work, I think that we will never go back to everybody being office based. I think so. That's been a big watershed.
Mm.
In our industry, I think it has meant that people are more comfortable using digital tools, and by people I mean both staff and customers. I think that a lot of more people are comfortable with using video and sort of video calling, and I think there's a larger proportion of the population that are comfortable using digital, but I would argue that that's still quite a long way from being 100% of the population.
Yeah.
And so a watershed definitely, but it hasn't changed everybody and their outlook at all. And we've still got to make sure we can service every customer through whichever channel they want to be serviced.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about it sort of being, what's the digital journey, what's digital transformation, as if that was almost like the end point, rather than it being sort of like, and now you're saying, well, actually, not everyone can do that. I mean, is it still an endpoint, or do you think we're just reaching a greater level of maturity now around, how do we sort of think of it in the context of processes, really?
So it's a really good point they're about processes. So we tend to think of things when we're sort of doing planning in two different ways. We tend to think about processes and process automation, and can we create better processes that can be automated more? And so I believe in 2023 there will be real innovation in additional new processes that many of our clients are going to need to implement, and that includes offering more services to help people, putting them in touch with people that can offer them solutions, whether it's a debt charity or something else with regards to vulnerability, or it's income maximization, what have you. So from a process perspective, we don't expect that will ever change. And our view on it is that we just need to be in a position to automate as much as that as we can, as intelligently as we can. And the intelligence piece comes back down to data. And data is also never going to end, but will allow us to inform that operational decision-making process, better and better. And I believe in the credit collections industry, we still have a long way to go in terms of the way in which we use data, the way we collaborate using data, the reciprocity of the data that's available to be used. There's lots of steps there. And every single day I learn something new that I didn't know about the industry and the data that's available in the industry. And I work in it. So if you're a person that doesn't work in the sector, how on earth are you going to know, for example, how to get better benefits, or how to get a social tariff, or whatever it might be? So I think there's an ongoing process of improvement, and digital will become more and more crucial as part of that, but it needs to be supported by improved processes and obviously better use of data as we go. Yeah.
And you talked a bit about collections process. We talked about it sort of seeing upstream and customers being sort of quite proactive around things like managing energy costs and those kind of things. I mean, how much of an effort do you think we've got to try and put on that pre-collections process or the pre-arrears process? I mean, are you seeing people starting to turn to that as almost like, if something happens, then we're here to support you? I mean, do you think, are we making enough effort around that?
We certainly have a lot of conversations about it. So I would say when we're doing, solution demos or workshops, it is one of the first three questions that get asked, I would say now. Interestingly, it's moved up the list ahead of later stage things around, say, debt sale or legal and litigation, which tells me that probably the ultimate sponsors of large transformational projects, rather than thinking about the bottom line of can I make a debt sale or whatever, they're probably more thinking about actually how can I manage my vulnerable customers better, which is great. So therefore, I think it is becoming more and more important. And I think when we talk about vulnerability, particularly, people are now saying it doesn't matter whether someone's missed a payment or not. We would like to know as much as we can about them and help them as much as we can. Even if it's a relatively temporary piece of vulnerability, we want to reach out and offer them help. And if there's data that's available, a customer might have not missed a payment in 10 years if they're a mortgage client, but you find out a piece of information about them that you think you can help them with, reach out anyway. So that's certainly something that I think is becoming more and more important.
It's quite an interesting indicator, or like mini indicator of hierarchy of conversations, isn't it? The fact that it's moved up, because it was always a difficult area. I mean, collections is always difficult around, pre-collections and what do you actually talk about, and that was always, it was so tricky that almost like it didn't quite get maybe the attention that maybe it needed to.
Yeah,
but it feels like it's moving up with the importance.
Yes, I think so, and I think it's not necessarily even that they're expecting someone to start missing payments. It's more that, for example, they've reached a certain age, or something has come up in the data that says this person would benefit from some sort of reach out just to check they're okay. And that reach out could be a digital one. It doesn't have to be via the telephone. And then if we find out that actually they're completely fine, we won't change anything. If we found out that actually, it turns out they are about to lose their job because the data told us this was likely and that's true, then we can deal with it in a different way. But again, everything's got to be permission-based. So if there's a handoff point that says, here's where you might go for some help with X, Y, or Z, they have to agree to want to do that. So, but I think it's absolutely okay to identify someone that might have a risk and reach out to them proactively. There's no risk in doing that. It's what you do next, where there potentially is risk, but you're still trying to help them, right? So,
I just think it's fascinating. Like the more we talk about it, the more we get into like how do you talk about value exchange as an example, or you talk about pre-arrears. We get into almost like marketing type areas. It's like how do you sell them? Just like you used to sell people on how to get out of debt. It's like this is how do you sell them on getting support, and what are some of the marketing techniques or
Yeah.
applicable techniques that can then be used to move across into this kind of field. I think it's fascinating,
No, it
really.
is really fascinating. I mean, one of the things that I think have been really underused in our sector is community technology. So
Mm,
there are some fantastic communities that are out there attached to various different brands. The most famous one, I guess, or one of the most famous is probably GiveGaff. It's a business built on
mm,
community. But what community technology can do is it can help people get advice from their peer group rather than thinking someone's trying to sell me something or catch me out or trip me up
mm,
or whatever. Because unfortunately in Britain we are really cynical about large companies
yeah.
and or companies collecting debt. But community technology can sometimes help with that. However, I've not really seen it in our industry yet. Um,
Mm,
I've had several conversations with C-level people who would like to do more of it, particularly in the long-term debt space, debt purchases, debt services. But I've yet to see it really take off. But that could be one of the things that will start to happen in the future, just because the sheer volume of things that are going to be coming through. The reason that GiftGaff did it was partly because of the brand, but also because a lot of the issues that they were facing could actually have been solved within the community.
mm,
So that's what
mm,
they allowed to happen. They would still monitor to make sure that nobody's telling someone the wrong way to do something. But actually,
yeah.
that's ultimately why it's about sort of the group helping each other. Which, if you think about it, in other aspects of our lives, we're all probably members of different groups for different things, and we're passing good ideas through social channels or whatever. So there's no reason why, with the right level of monitoring, that couldn't exist within the debt space, and it could help signpost people to sites like Policy and Practice, where there's
Mm.
benefits calculators to make sure people are on the right benefits. You know,
Yeah, I mean, you see quite a lot of that in the software space, don't you? I think my mobile phone provider does it as well in terms of like help and those kind of things. In terms of like,
yeah,
how do you do that? How do you do that in terms of, I suppose, things like vulnerable support and those kind of things? It could be quite an interesting kind of
yeah. Look,
area
like I
for
say,
it.
you've got to be really, really careful that the content is correct and
Mm,
that it's in areas whereby people can't, bad actors can't have a voice. So
mm,
I'm not saying it's easy, and I think that's probably why the industry has been reasonably resistant, because the policing of it can be difficult. But I certainly know in the fraud space, for example, there's been a lot of work in that space, and it's really paid dividends.
yeah,
There's been a lot of information sharing, but there's also been a lot of best practice being discussed at the consumer level through these sorts of things as well. So,
yeah.
so that's one tip for maybe not 2023, but maybe 2023, 2024.
Yeah.
More use of community, I think, could work.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of the big software companies, I mean, where they do it now, I mean, they have to moderate the discussion as well. I mean, they're going to have some
Correct.
of the same issues. I mean, they're lightning rods for a lot of bad comment, I would think as well, and they probably have to moderate it pretty heavily,
Well,
I
that's a
imagine
whole
as
lot, yeah.
well.
And that's, I've spent a bit of time on that side in my career as well. And there is absolutely that. There is software that then goes on top to monitor negative
Yeah,
sentiment, untruths, etc., etc. And of course, the community officer themselves should be in the conversation. So
yeah,
it's completely fine, for and other water companies, community officer to be involved in the conversation, making sure that they're pointing people in the right direction. But
yeah.
if someone else can do that for them as part of that community, then that's good news for everybody. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So going back to, I suppose, customers and sort of contact as well. I mean, where do you sort of see in terms of like, so we always talk about contact channels or engagement or those kind of things. I mean, community brings up things like behavioral scoring or behavioral economics. But I mean, what are you seeing in terms of like trends in terms of contact channels and then in terms of engagement as well? New ways of getting hold of people, particularly when we need to,
Yeah.
when we need to offer them support.
Yeah. So, I mean, we partner with different organizations who offer different channels of engagement.
Mm,
Webio would be a good example of that. And I think the ideal thing is to understand where people spend their time.
mm,
And then once we understand that, it's then what sort of messages can we deliver to them through that channel and what sort of outcomes can we get. So Webio, as an example, is good for two-way conversational messaging, and there are some simple transactions you can execute through those channels
mm,
via a WhatsApp or various other social media sites, but also through conventional email, SMS, or whatever. Where you need them to do something a bit more complex and have a more complicated journey, then that's where you might want to do a self-service activity or something like that. We partner with a number of suppliers. DebtStream is probably our most mature partnership in that space, and that is more than just conversational. That is a series of options based on a series of data steps to then get the customer to then do any number of debt resolution situations, or multiple, depending upon how you've set things up. If they have multiple products with you, they may end up doing multiple things, through that site. We, as a software provider, we act as the orchestration for that. So we make sure that we have the right data to present the right messages and the right levels of options into those channels. And obviously, we try and do it in real time and pass the information back in real time to the core system, as we would call it, because that's ultimately the system of record. And should that customer then ring in because they're not sure if something's handled digitally, an agent needs to be able to see exactly what has happened. But in terms of the channels of engagement, definitely more and more people are moving online. More and more people are happy to do things within, say, Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever. But ultimately, there still needs to be a complete audit trail so that should something go wrong, everybody can see what has happened. And so there is an expectation that will happen, and people still virtually everybody we work with still sends various confirmatory emails and things like that with reference numbers on them, just so that there's a level of satisfaction for the customer, just to make sure they know what they've done and everybody's clear and comfortable. So in that way, it's slightly old-fashioned, but it's necessary as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. It's coming back to that whole ecosystem piece, and then how do you sort of orchestrate the ecosystem and having everything in one place so you can actually audit it. I mean, certainly financial services and all your utilities, it's going to be so critical, isn't it?
Absolutely,
to make sure
correct.
you actually understand actually what happened, and almost like that becomes almost like a barrier to integration to a certain extent, because the compliance piece or the audit tracking.
Integration will solve a number of those issues, but where you hand off a customer to say an organization that helps. Let's say we've identified that the customer is a reasonably recent refugee, and we've handed them off to someone who can help them with housing and maybe speaking Ukrainian. We can audit that we've sent them, but what then happens after that, unless they tell us, that's where the communication loop stops.
Yeah.
And we can only make decisions about what to do next with them based on the information we have at the time. So if they don't tell us what happened with their housing benefit or whatever, we can only make decisions on the previous point to that, the fact that we sent them there. So that feedback loop, once we start going out into the ecosystem to providers who are doing things that are not directly related to the account that the person perhaps is overdue on, that's where it gets a bit more tricky. But I think it's still important. If there's help that's available to people and you know where it is, you should still send them, but you just have to accept that you may not get all the data you need to work out what's happened. And that's just something we've got to get on with as an industry, really.
And what about things like engagement? So I was having a bit of fun. I've been looking at ChatGPT. It's made quite a lot of noise over the last few weeks in terms of like automated conversations, certainly conversations, those kind of things. I mean, do you think that's going to sort of eat into some of the conversations we already have, or maybe make them even more sophisticated than we've already got, versus some of the existing sort of, I suppose, web chat response type channels, or just even greater sophistication around some of the chat that takes place?
Technically, there is software out there that can understand sentiment both in the way things are said and the words that are used, and there is already AI-driven conversations, and there is the whole idea of the metaverse, which is that things can be controlled by the user, and the next thing that needs to happen can render, and it is almost like watching TV, but they're almost kind of making it up as you go along to suit your journey. So in theory, all of the technology exists to basically give people almost anything that they want on a virtual basis, which means that you could have a completely automated conversation filled with empathy with a person who looks as real as you or I, but is actually computer rendered, in theory, that is available now. All of those component parts are together. Of course, in reality, that's an awful lot of things to build. And at the moment, the only people that are building it are the big tech companies, along with, say, I don't know, a big motor finance or a big motor business who are just for concept stuff. So, in the metaverse, I've seen people looking to buy a car, and in theory, they could say, show me the back seat, and the avatar would go and show the back seat or what have you. So that's fine. And in collections, there is a finite amount of endpoints that you can go to, and so in theory, you could have those conversations about those endpoints. The bits that I struggle with still with all of this technology is how do you emote realistically, and how can you ever have a way of dealing with people's lives that might have multiple different things that need dealing with at the same time, and each one is individual. And so that's the bit I find hard to fully A, automate, and B, say that we'll ever be able to remove people completely from process.
I think I almost like to see it almost like if you ever play games and you have these like non-player characters and you can interact with them, right? So you can go into somewhere and you can
It's
interact
exactly
with
like
someone.
that.
And you can interact with them and you can have some really interesting conversations as long as within the confines of the
Correct.
game. But if you want to talk about something that's outside the confines of the game, or if you want to rely on the information or rely on it as advice, how do you make sure the advice is actually correct? And how do you make sure that they're giving the answer? And at what point then do you then have to refer to an agent to do that?
Yeah.
And then I suppose on the converse of that, then how do you make sure that the advice that a person gives has the same level of detail or transparency behind it as say the computer might do? I mean, it's almost like how do you find the right tool for the job at the right time?
Absolutely. And the answer is I don't think anyone's quite worked that out yet, because there is so much now that you need to know about when you're dealing with any vulnerable customer. And in fact, even if you're just dealing with a non-vulnerable customer with a complex product, there's a lot there. So yes, in theory, you could build all of that into some answer database for chatbots or whatever. But as I say, going back to my original point, it's still quite difficult to then use the right levels of emotion. And again, all of this software, there is software out there that does all of this stuff, but pulling it all together and doing it intelligently and making it completely foolproof, I think, is a real challenge. And there are many of us who just want to speak to an empathetic human being, talk about the football, talk about the weather, relax a little bit, and then get to the nub of it. And, the whole small talk bit, I'm not sure that we've got yet.
It's interesting, isn't it? So how much of the almost like the collections experience is going to be about the pragmatic advice, which is what as business we would say it's all about pragmatic advice. It's like we've got to give the right solutions, trying to give people solutions as quick as possible, those kind of things, versus actually the human small talk and the empathy, and they're very sort of subtle things that are very hard to put at least a dollar figure or a pound figure on. I mean, and where's the balance? Where's the balance of that?
Yeah, exactly. All I would say is that when I've been involved in offshoring projects, there's always been a little bit of an element of having to lifestyle train an agent that might be, say, sat in India or in South Africa about things like the cost of school fees in Britain, or the cost of satellite television, sports, whatever, or any number of local things that are the way in which we do things locally. And so that isn't necessarily a functional answer to anything. It's just actually being able to understand that what the person is talking about, how much value it does or doesn't have, and why it's important or not important. So paying the school fees for some people in certain areas might be far more important than something else, but you're far less likely to know about it if you're offshore, let alone if you're actually not even if effectively this is an entirely virtual experience, and therefore there's only a stock level number of answers that you can talk about. So I think ultimately there is going to always need to be a need for people. But those people need to be more and more well trained, and they need to be able to use the technology and understand it as well. So it's not an either or.
Yeah, the analogy I was thinking of is what's happening to retail as an
Mm.
example. So retail's become, if you want to be very functional, go online. So we all go online, we buy stuff, and it's very functional online. It's very quick. You probably get a slightly cheaper price
Yeah,
potentially as well,
yeah,
and it arrives very quick. But that's not the reason why you necessarily go to the shops. I mean, we're talking about going to the shops over the weekend, and it's like, and you go there for the experience. You go there for, if it's Christmas, so, you go there for the sausages in the buns and the coffee and the experience of it, rather than necessarily just
yeah.
because you want to buy stuff, right? And do you think that'll happen to collections though as well, where it becomes, maybe even a differentiator of service, in terms of what you want to do when you want to do it?
Yeah, I think there's going to be an element of that. I think we all need to be aware that certain individuals like to build up relationships, particularly, I think,
Mm,
people who are new to a process, they like to get comfortable with an individual. And I think it's worth people acknowledging that and working with that. And certainly within our system, if we've spotted that an individual has been on the phone for a period of time with a particular agent, if the rules allow, we would probably look to sort of reroute that person back to that agent if
mm,
that makes sense, and that's the policy. So I think there's definitely that for certain. There's a comfort factor, but there's also a convenience factor. So if you are sat on a bus or you've got a couple of minutes wherever you might be, you don't want to do that. You just want to quickly engage the way you want to engage. And I think the key is just making sure that our end user customers are educated about how we all work. So, hey, if you want to have a chat with someone, that's great. If you want to just use some sort of an app or self-service, here's how you do it. That's great. If you want to have a bit of both, you can use web chat. Here's how it goes. If you want to do it
mm,
in a different way, that's fine. And then the other thing is content. So I think video is now a very accepted means of creating content in the world, and yet in our industry, we don't use it very often. So,
mm,
for example, if someone needs to fill out a form to make a claim for a benefit because they're vulnerable, I don't know, but I've not seen any videos that just show them how to do that. And
yeah,
yet, most of us would think nothing of going on YouTube and looking at a recipe to how to make whatever,
yeah,
including I say the elderly, the older generation are now comfortable with that, but yet we as an
yeah.
industry aren't yet using it. But a good curated journey could say, actually, I know you want to find out these pieces of information. If you want to speak to this person, do this. If you want to try and have a look at yourself, here's a video. Let us know what you thought, whether it was helpful, and if not, we'll call you
Mm,
anyway. So, I
mm.
think we're missing a few bits in the process that would make it a lot easier for everybody.
Yeah, and it comes back a little bit back to that idea, right? How do you make it an experience,
Yeah,
and an engaging experience as much as possible in the
yeah,
world? And that's, I mean, we're sort of up for competing with time with that, aren't we? In terms of like getting hold of people, right? As an
yeah.
industry.
We are, and I think at a branding level, none of the from a collections perspective, there's still a lot of work to be done. There's been a lot of improvement done, and I think if you go and look at
Mm,
Trustpilot reviews or other things, some of the people in our industry are doing much better now. But they're still probably not the place that you would go to talk about all your financial woes.
mm,
But they could be, and if they give you help in other areas, as I say, for example, helping show you what benefits you get, or helping show you how you could find a lost pension that you forgot you had, or whatever the thing might be, the brand value will improve, because I think most organizations want to have long-term relationships with their customers,
mm,
even if that's in the debt space. So by adding these extra things in, that's great. But the value exchange there is, you engage with us, and we'll show you how perhaps we can help you with this thing over here, or we'll reduce your payments if that's the right thing to do, etc. Um,
yeah.
and I think some general financial service education would help as well. So, just people understanding that if they show that they've got a little bit more disposable income, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be asked to increase their payments. It
Mm.
just means that people have a better understanding of what's happening, and equally they can treat them better if that reduces, and so on. So I think there's just an ongoing process of education that I think we could all be doing better.
So obviously we've been through a time of huge sort of change over the last couple of years. I mean, where do you sort of see us going into the rest of the new year?
So I think we are probably not going to see as many large scale transformational projects as we would
Mm,
like. I think there's a worry that further bad things are going to happen, and that people don't want to
mm,
be putting all of their their resources into major change projects in case they need them to pivot and to do something else. So we're expecting people to do much more incremental change, little pieces where there's real pain, process pain or whatever, to do those sorts of, fix those sorts of things. So what we're looking to do with a number of partners is to make things as easy as possible to try and take out the need for large scale IT projects, and actually sort of put more things in the hands of business, but also create clear benefits and clear value very quickly. Where obviously some large scale transformation projects, you kick them off and the value might kick in a year's time or even longer. We're trying to do things at a simpler level, get to deliver more value more quickly, but we're not there might be part of a long term transformational piece, but actually they'll deliver value quickly, particularly in digital services, but also, as we talked about previously, integrating new data services to give people more options, and make sure that those options are available in an easy to use and consume way.
Right.
So,
It's
that's
almost like a modular type approach. So it's almost like with much
yeah,
shorter sort of time to delivery almost as well. So
yeah.
people can see it.
We obviously, software providers would all love to get into some big transformational projects, and we still have a handful of those that we're involved in. But I think it's more about getting to value quicker, and having perhaps multiple work streams that might happen, but they all take a bit, shorter period of time, and they deliver value, and they almost pay for the next thing to happen. We have that with there is going to be a growth in certain sectors, and that particularly sort of the sort of what I would call more tactical lending space, I would say. And in that space, they're expecting a lot of their customers to unfortunately fall into arrears, and those businesses won't scale using people, so they will need technology to support that, and that's what we're looking to try and help them with. But it will be done, as I say, in a modular basis, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly going to be an interesting year. See how things. It's been an interesting couple of years, isn't it, in terms of how things have sort of played out, and there's been huge amounts of change, I suppose. But it'll be interesting to see what happens in 23, really.
Yep, definitely. And we're just hoping for no more major world events that impact us all. Yeah. That's I think many of us, we don't know what it's going to be, but we're now kind of fatigued of it, and we're just thinking, well, what could the next thing possibly be? And I think that's why, as I said earlier, people aren't necessarily throwing everything into a massive change, because there might be something else downstream that we just haven't seen yet.
Yeah, hopefully we want to sort of gradually be on an up curve if we can, or at least a stable curve anyway, because there's been so many shocks, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's been very hard to plan. Well, Guy, thanks very much for making the time. I really appreciate it. As ever, it's always an interesting conversation when you and I chat. So, so I really appreciate it.
No worries. All right. Thanks, Chris.